been going Democratic in presidential contests in recent years. So in a few seconds, those states will be closing their polls, and presumably we'll be able to see what's going on and make perhaps a major projection at that point. This is a moment a lot of people have been waiting for. This is a moment that potentially
A child who is born today will not think anything is unusual about an African American becoming the President of the United States. But during the days of Jim Crow, an African American could not even find a decent job because of the color of his skin. Imagine this was the law. Imagine the law allowed police to do this to another human being. Imagine it was legal to murder a person, to hang a person for all to see and celebrate, to burn them alive, because of the color of their skin. Under the Jim Crow laws, the discrimination and torture of black people was allowed and legal. So who was Jim Crow?
The name Jim Crow was used to describe the segregation laws and customs in the U.S. between 1877 until the mid-1960s. Jim Crow was a song. An actor by the name of Thomas Dartmouth Rice would put on black makeup and pretend to be a black man called Jim Crow.
I want everybody to know. Why don't you get together?
However, his act was a highly insulting stereotype of a black man. Jim Crow style comedy was a disturbing success all over the world. Masses of white audiences enjoyed black people being portrayed as singing and dancing fools.
Alabama's a good place to go.
During the Jim Crow years, a great number of black Americans stood up for their rights. Prominent cases included: in 1896, Homer Plessy, of mixed race, sat in a whites-only bus and got arrested. During his trial, he said he committed his crime to raise awareness about racial discrimination. The result was the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling that sanctioned separate but equal segregation of the races. In 1906, the only criminal case in Supreme Court history, Ed Johnson, a black American, was found guilty for a crime he did not commit, raping a white woman. Ed Johnson was hanged from a bridge by a mob that included Hamilton County Sheriff Joseph Shipp. Sheriff Shipp was found guilty of criminal contempt for lynching Ed Johnson in Chattanooga, Tennessee. In 1954, the landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The judges unanimously agreed that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. In 1954, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her bus seat at the front of the colored section of the bus to a white man. Her arrest inspired the Montgomery bus boycott, which was led by Martin Luther King Jr. The boycott lasted 381 days and led to the Supreme Court ruling that the bus segregation law was unconstitutional. Using peaceful protests and demonstrations, Black Americans were gaining momentum in achieving equal rights and recognition. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was at the helm.
Martin Luther King was a highly educated Southern Baptist preacher. In 1957, he achieved national attention by becoming the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Martin Luther King and fellow civil rights activists Charles Steele and Fred Shuttlesworth founded the SCLC. The SCLC became a major force in organizing the civil rights movement, basing their principles on nonviolence and civil disobedience. During the next decade, there were a number of landmark events that bolstered the movement. 1957. 9 Black students at Central High School are blocked from entering the school. President Eisenhower sent the National Guard to assist the 9 students. 1960. 4 Black college students staged the first sit-in at a segregated lunch counter. 1961. More than 1,000 pro-civil rights volunteers, black and white, began taking bus trips through the South to test out the new laws which prohibit segregation on public transit vehicles. In 1963, Martin Luther King was arrested. The letter he wrote from his cell argued that people have the moral duty to disobey unjust laws. On August 28, 1963, 200,000 people of all races joined the March on Washington. The marchers gathered at Lincoln Memorial where Martin Luther King delivered his most famous speech, "I Have a Dream." The march was pivotal to President Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which criminalized discrimination. In 1965, civil rights activists led by Martin Luther King Jr. attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery. The goal of the march was to protest against voting rules which discriminated against African Americans. The first march was stopped by a police blockade. The police then brutalized dozens of participants, causing the event to be dubbed Bloody Sunday. The march helped push through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made it easier for Southern blacks to register to vote. On April 3, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the last speech of his life, "I Have Seen the Promised Land."
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing